The ISM paper I wrote in this presentation seeks to answer the question, why is there a disproportionality of African American students in special education? My reason for choosing this topic was sparked by a conversation I had with a reading interventionist at my school last year. She was providing me, the special education teacher, with an update on Ryan, a student she was working with. Pseudonyms have been provided to protect confidentiality. After reviewing her data and some student work samples, she made a comment about how she was glad Ryan was going through the special education referral process, but that we'd have to wait until next year for Chris because we wouldn't want to refer too many black boys for special education. As a result, I will take a critical look at this issue and its presence in public education by reviewing what the data and statistics reveal, the possible causes for this inequality, the implications this has on African American students, and the specific action that educators can take to create change. Also, it is important to note that the disproportionality in special education occurs across all minority groups. This presentation, however, will focus solely on the African American population. First, I will review the existing research and data that reveals the disproportionality among African American students in special education. The 41st Annual Report of Congress on the Implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2019 analyzes the percentage of students ages 6 through 21 served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. According to the most recent data from 2017, 12.2% of African American students are receiving special education. As a comparison, white students had a risk index of 8.6%, and Hispanic or Latino students had a risk index of 9.6%. A risk ratio is also calculated. Black or African American students had a risk ratio of 1.4, and a risk ratio over 1 signifies a greater likelihood to be served under IDEA than any other racial or ethnic group. Therefore, the term overrepresentation more clearly describes the disproportionality that exists in special education. Additionally, when reviewing special education eligibility categories, disproportionality also exists among the African American population. African Americans have a risk ratio of 2.2 for intellectual disability, which is higher than all other racial groups. African Americans have a risk ratio of 2.0 for emotional disturbance, which again is higher than all other racial groups. There are several reasons why this inequity exists. Response to intervention was initiated in hopes of reducing the educational inequality. However, the multi-tiered system of supports continues to be troubled by racial disproportionality. Nationwide, there is some ambiguity among the validity, implementation, consistency, and evaluation of RTI interventions. Although the RTI process may be followed, African American students are 1.5 more times likely to be referred for special education than their white peers. The presence of poverty is another reason for the disproportionality. According to the United States Census Bureau and data from 2019, the poverty rates for blacks was 18.8%, which is higher than all other races, and this has been a consistent trend. Low-income families often do not have access to the resources to enhance their child's development, so as a result, poverty is often linked to lower academic achievement in school. A more detailed review suggests that poverty and race have deep historical roots that suggest a systemic problem. These historic racial disparities exist in all areas of life, including receiving loans from a bank, unequal housing laws, income levels, access to health care, and the list continues. Nieto and Bodie explained that the historical effects of institutionalized racism in U.S. society are deeply enduring and starkly visible, and they have influenced the education of children of color for centuries. Another factor, perhaps even further ingrained in society, is what we believe and act on in an unconscious manner. The term discrit has been coined, which combines theories and discussions from disability studies and the critical race theory to examine the ways in which race and disability have been built into the institutions of education. According to the discrit perspective, the implicit biases or the attitudes and stereotypes we associate others to, often without our conscious knowledge, may explain why African Americans are overrepresented in special education. This disproportionality has negative impacts on students. There is a correlation between the prevalence of African American students in special education and the juvenile system. This has been referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline and explains how minority groups and those with disabilities are suspended from school and incarcerated at higher rates. Tracking is often used in schools to group students by ability levels, and research shows this tracking is often linked to race. In a sense, tracking is a form of segregation, as students in special education are often served in more restrictive settings with less rigorous curriculum. They are most likely to be subjected to rote memorization and static teaching methods, as well as a curriculum that focuses solely on mastering the basics. Placement in special education has been correlated to lower levels of academic achievement, higher rates of school dropout, less years in post-secondary education, higher rates of unemployment, and lower income levels due to lower paying jobs that require less qualifications. As a result, African American students who are unnecessarily placed in special education are placed at a disadvantage. Although special education is a system that intends to help and support students, it could be doing more damage for their later life and adulthood when provided without need. These statistics and harmful outcomes can be disheartening, but there are things that we can do as teachers to elicit change and make a difference. Teachers need to recognize the implicit biases they hold and how this affects their judgments and behaviors. Research has revealed that African American students are not overrepresented in medically defined categories, such as blind, deaf, or other health impairment. Yet eligibility categories that are more subjective, such as emotional disturbance and specific learning disability, do have an overrepresentation of African American students. Schools and teachers need to critically evaluate RTI. It is imperative that educators and schools implement a tiered approach to evaluating and addressing needs if one is not present. Also, schools that have a system in place need to review the existing RTI model and ensure its validity and reliability. A problem-solving team's role should be to document academic or behavioral difficulties the child is exhibiting, ensure the child is receiving research-based core curriculum, provide evidence-based interventions, and monitor the child's progress for a sustained amount of time. And then lastly, consider special education with the data gathered from this process, if progress is not being adequately made. Cultural differences should not account for the overrepresentation of African Americans in special education, yet research shows that this is often the case. Nieto and Bodie reveal that the refusal to acknowledge differences often results in schools and teachers labeling children's behavior as deficient or deviant and unnecessarily referring them. Multicultural education is a comprehensive framework requiring teachers to consider many aspects such as the actual curriculum, teachers' attitudes and expectations, cultural values and practices, cultural views of education, and so many others. In order to really consider these aspects, teachers would benefit from professional development to learn about instructional strategies and how to implement them in culturally responsive ways. In the African American community specifically, teachers may consider learning more about the African American vernacular English, as well as hip-hop, which has deep roots in this culture. By considering and integrating hip-hop, language dialects, and other unique aspects of culture into the classroom, teachers provide more meaningful and inclusive school experiences. When schools become more attuned to children's cultures, academic achievement improves. And the best way to learn more about students and their culture is by interacting frequently with families. Through continued communication with parents and encouraging their involvement in the school, partnerships are developed that value high expectations for students, cultural understanding, and acceptance. To conclude, I want to be sure that in schools around the nation, Ryan, who I referenced earlier, is being referred for special education services because he hasn't made progress in previous interventions, and isn't just being referred because he has a behavior concern. I also want to be sure that Chris, who may benefit from specialized instruction, isn't being delayed referral to special education and services he may qualify for because we are looking at his skin color and tracking our numbers, rather than giving him access to services he needs. In order to ensure equity and academic progress for Ryan, Chris, and their peers, educators and society need to take a critical look at the disproportionality among African American students in special education, have difficult conversations, and be willing to adjust our practices.